In the heart of London, where history and modernity intertwined seamlessly, stood Buckingham Palace, a symbol of tradition, royalty, and pride. Outside its grand gates, tourists from all over the world gathered to witness the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. Among them was Corporal James Harrington, a member of the Queen's Guard, standing tall in his striking red tunic and towering bearskin hat. His posture was impeccable, his gaze fixed straight ahead, unwavering despite the chaos around him. James wasn't just another guard. He carried with him a legacy of discipline and service. Born to a British mother and an immigrant father, James had grown up hearing stories about courage and sacrifice. He joined the military not only out of patriotism, but also to prove that heritage didn't define one's worth. It was actions that mattered. Today, like every other day, he took immense pride in wearing the uniform, knowing it represented centuries of dedication and honor. The square buzzed with energy. Families snapped pictures, children pointed excitedly at the guards, and street performers entertained the crowd nearby. But amidst the cheerful atmosphere, there was someone whose presence felt out of place, a man named Richard Grayson. Richard was loud, rude, and clearly unhappy. As he pushed through the crowd, muttering under his breath, people instinctively moved out of his way. There was something unsettling about him. His clenched fists, his scowl, and the large German shepherd straining against its leash by his side. Richard stopped near James, glaring at him with undisguised contempt. He didn't try to hide his disdain as he began making snide comments about James's appearance. "Look at you," Richard sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think dressing up like some fancy doll makes you better than everyone else." When James didn't respond, Richard grew bolder. "Or is it because of your background? Do they let just anyone wear that uniform these days?" The insults stung, though James didn't show it. Years of training had taught him to remain calm under pressure. His job wasn't to engage or retaliate. It was to stand firm, no matter what. Still, Richard's words lingered in the air, sharp and cutting. The tourists around them started whispering nervously, unsure of what might happen next. Some stepped back, sensing trouble brewing, while others pulled out their phones, ready to record whatever unfolded. What made things worse was the dog. It was massive, muscular, and clearly trained to be aggressive. Every time Richard yanked on the leash, the animal growled low in its throat, its teeth flashing menacingly. The tension escalated when Richard leaned closer to James, practically spitting his hateful words. "Bet you can't handle yourself without that fancy stick of yours," he taunted, referring to the ceremonial rifle James held upright beside him. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The bustling square, the clicking cameras, the anxious murmurs, all overshadowed by the looming threat of violence. Richard's eyes gleamed with malice as he contemplated his next move. And then, with a sudden jerk, he unclipped the leash. The moment Richard unclipped the leash, the German shepherd lunged forward with a ferocious growl, its powerful body propelling it toward James like a bolt of lightning. The crowd gasped in unison, their collective breath catching in their throats. Children clung to their parents, and some people instinctively stepped back, creating a wide circle around the scene. For a fleeting second, it seemed as though chaos would erupt right there in the middle of the bustling square. But James didn't flinch. Years of rigorous training had prepared him for moments like this, not just physically, but mentally. His mind raced, analyzing the situation in an instant. He knew that reacting impulsively or showing fear could escalate things further. Instead, he relied on his instincts, moving with precision and calmness that belied the danger before him. As the dog barreled toward him, snarling and snapping, James shifted his weight slightly, stepping sideways to avoid a direct collision. The maneuver worked. The dog missed its target, skidding past James and momentarily losing momentum. But it wasn't over yet. The animal spun around quickly, its hackles raised, ready to charge again. This time, however, James did something unexpected. He dropped to one knee, lowering himself to the dog's level. His movements were deliberate and controlled, exuding confidence without aggression. Then, in a steady voice filled with authority, he spoke softly but firmly. "Easy now," he said, extending his hand palm down, a universal gesture meant to reassure an agitated animal. To everyone watching, it felt like time slowed down. No one could believe what they were seeing. The same dog that had been snarling viciously just moments ago suddenly paused, its ears twitching as if confused by James's calm demeanor. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the beast stopped growling and took a cautious step forward. Its sharp eyes locked onto James's face, searching for any sign of threat. Finding none, the dog lowered its head and wagged its tail tentatively before sitting down obediently at James's feet. A stunned silence fell over the crowd, followed by an eruption of applause. People cheered, whistling and clapping as though they'd witnessed a miracle. Some even wiped away tears, overwhelmed by the display of grace under pressure. Cameras flashed, capturing every detail of the surreal moment. Yet through it all, James remained unfazed. His focus never wavered from the task at hand, ensuring the safety of everyone present, including the dog. Richard, on the other hand, looked utterly dumbfounded. His plan to humiliate James had backfired spectacularly. Instead of cowering or retaliating, James had turned the situation on its head, using skill and composure to defuse the threat. Richard's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger as murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Leave him alone," while another added, "That poor dog doesn't deserve to be treated like that." Still holding the leash in his hand, Richard sputtered, trying to regain control of the narrative. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" He spat, pointing a finger at James. "This isn't over. You've got no right to interfere with my property." His words were met with boos and jeers from the onlookers, who clearly sided with the guard. Even the dog seemed uninterested in Richard now, content to stay seated beside James, its tail thumping gently against the ground. James finally stood up, his towering figure casting a shadow over Richard. Though his expression remained neutral, there was an undeniable air of authority about him. Without raising his voice, he addressed Richard directly. "Sir," he began, his tone measured and respectful despite the circumstances, "your dog is safe, and no harm has been done. I suggest you leave peacefully before this escalates further." It was a simple statement, yet it carried weight, leaving no room for argument. For a brief moment, Richard hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. But pride, or perhaps sheer stubbornness, kept him rooted in place. Clutching the leash tightly, he muttered more accusations under his breath, refusing to back down. Little did he know, his actions were being recorded by dozens of phones, each video destined to spread across social media within minutes. What started as a petty attempt to provoke a reaction had spiraled into something far bigger than Richard could have anticipated. And James, he simply stood there, calm and resolute, embodying the very essence of dignity and restraint. As the crowd continued to cheer and applaud, James's calm demeanor never faltered. He stood tall, his posture unwavering, as though nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. The German shepherd remained seated at his feet, its tail wagging lazily, seemingly content in his presence. It was a surreal sight. This towering figure in ceremonial uniform, now accompanied by a once aggressive dog that appeared more like a loyal companion than a threat. Richard, however, was far from done. His face flushed with anger and humiliation. He took a step closer to James, pointing an accusatory finger. "You had no right to touch my dog," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his frustration. "This is ridiculous. You're supposed to be some kind of guard, not a dog trainer." His words echoed through the square, but they only served to highlight his own instability. The onlookers exchanged glances, many shaking their heads or rolling their eyes. Some even began openly mocking him, their voices rising above the din. James didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he responded with the same quiet authority that had already won over the crowd. "Sir," he said, his tone firm yet respectful. "Your dog posed a risk to public safety. My actions were necessary to prevent harm. If you'd like to discuss this further, I suggest we do so calmly." His words carried a subtle challenge, an invitation for Richard to either de-escalate or reveal himself as the aggressor he truly was. But Richard wasn't interested in calm discussions. His pride wouldn't allow it. "Oh, you think you're so perfect, don't you?" he sneered, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "Standing there all high and mighty in your fancy hat, acting like you're better than everyone else. Well, let me tell you something. You're nothing but a glorified statue." The insults rolled off James as if they were water sliding off stone. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't give Richard the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Instead, he simply adjusted his grip on his ceremonial rifle, ensuring it remained upright and secure. The gesture was symbolic, a reminder that he was there to serve, protect, and uphold order, no matter how chaotic things became. By now, the situation had drawn the attention of nearby guards, who began moving cautiously toward the scene. They weren't alone. Several tourists had flagged down police officers patrolling the area, explaining what had happened. Within moments, 2 uniformed officers arrived, their presence immediately commanding respect. One of them approached Richard, while the other spoke briefly with James, gathering details about the incident. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" one officer asked Richard, his tone polite but firm. Richard immediately launched into a tirade, accusing James of misconduct and insisting that his rights were being violated. "He attacked my dog," Richard exclaimed, gesturing wildly. "I demand justice. This man should be fired for what he's done." The accusation drew murmurs of disbelief from the crowd. People began sharing their accounts with the officers, recounting how Richard had unleashed the dog and hurled insults at James. Several witnesses even showed the officers videos they'd recorded on their phones, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Each clip painted a clear picture. Richard was the instigator, and James had acted with remarkable restraint and professionalism. Meanwhile, James remained silent, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. When the officers turned to him for his version of events, he provided a concise and factual account, leaving out any emotional commentary. "The individual released his dog, which then charged at me," James explained. "I used nonviolent methods to neutralize the threat and ensure the safety of those present. No harm came to the animal." The officers nodded, clearly impressed by James's composure and clarity. Turning back to Richard, they informed him that he would need to accompany them to the station to file a formal complaint and to answer questions about his role in the incident. Richard balked at this, sputtering protests and refusing to cooperate. But when the officers reminded him that resisting could result in additional charges, he reluctantly relented, muttering curses under his breath as he was led away. As the tension dissipated, the crowd erupted into another round of applause for James. Strangers patted him on the shoulder, thanking him for handling the situation with such grace and skill. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking if they could take a photo with the hero guard. James politely declined, reminding everyone that he was simply doing his duty. Yet despite his humility, it was impossible to ignore the profound impact of what had just transpired. In a single moment, he had transformed a potential disaster into a testament to discipline, patience, and humanity. The police officers wasted no time in taking control of the situation. As Richard was escorted away, still muttering under his breath and shooting glares at James, the crowd began to disperse slowly, buzzing with animated conversations about what they had just witnessed. Some people lingered, eager to thank James personally or snap a few more photos before leaving. Others huddled together, replaying the events in vivid detail, their voices filled with admiration for the guard who had remained so composed under pressure. Meanwhile, the German Shepherd stayed close to James, its earlier aggression completely gone. It seemed almost confused by the sudden change in dynamics, looking between James and Richard as if trying to understand why its owner was being led away. One of the officers knelt beside the dog, speaking softly to calm it further, while examining its collar for identification tags. Finding none, he radioed for animal control to come and assess the situation. Until then, the dog would remain under the care of the authorities, and for now, near James, who had earned its trust in a way that felt almost miraculous. As the initial chaos settled, James finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. Though his face remained stoic, his mind raced with reflections on what had just happened. He knew that incidents like this were rare but not unheard of. Over the years, members of the Queen's Guard had faced everything from playful tourists attempting to distract them to outright hostility. But today's encounter had been different. It wasn't just about maintaining discipline or following protocol. It was personal. Richard's words had cut deep, targeting James's identity and heritage in a way that struck at the core of who he was. Yet, James reminded himself, reacting emotionally would have only given Richard exactly what he wanted, a reaction. By staying calm and focused, James hadn't just diffused the situation. He had shown the world what true strength looked like. Strength wasn't about shouting louder or fighting back. It was about rising above hatred and proving that dignity could never be shaken, no matter how hard someone tried to tear it down. The officers finished gathering statements from witnesses, many of whom praised James for his restraint and quick thinking. A young woman holding her phone stepped forward, showing them a video she'd recorded of the entire incident. "Look at how professional he was," she said, pointing to the screen. "That man was being awful, and the dog could have hurt someone, but this guard didn't even flinch. He handled it perfectly." Her words echoed the sentiments of nearly everyone present. James had turned a potentially dangerous moment into one of inspiration. Once the formalities were complete, the officers approached James once more to express their gratitude. "You did everything right," one of them said, shaking his hand firmly. "We'll make sure this gets documented properly. You should be proud of how you handled yourself." James nodded politely, offering a small smile but keeping his response brief. "Thank you," he said simply. "I was just doing my job." Before long, animal control arrived to take custody of the German Shepherd. The dog whimpered slightly as it was led away, casting one last glance at James before disappearing into the van. Watching it go, James felt a pang of sadness. Despite its earlier aggression, the animal hadn't been inherently bad. It had merely been a victim of poor training and misplaced anger. He hoped that wherever it ended up next, it would find kindness and patience instead of cruelty. As evening fell and the square grew quieter, James resumed his post outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists continued to trickle by, some stopping to ask if he was the same guard they'd seen in the viral videos already circulating online. James responded with polite nods and gentle reminders that he was on duty, steering clear of any attention-seeking behavior. Yet despite his reserved nature, he couldn't help but notice the shift in energy around him. People weren't just admiring the spectacle of the changing of the guard ceremony. They were watching him with newfound respect. Later that night, after his shift ended and he returned to the barracks, James found himself reflecting on the day's events. He thought about Richard's bitterness, the dog's confusion, and the overwhelming support from strangers who barely knew him. Most of all, he thought about the power of leading by example. In standing firm against hatred, he had sent a message far louder than words ever could. That courage isn't about dominance, it's about compassion. And sometimes, the simplest acts of grace can leave the most lasting impact. The days following the incident brought a whirlwind of attention that James hadn't anticipated. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, fueled by the viral videos and eyewitness accounts shared online. Headlines like "Royal Guard's Remarkable Composure in Face of Danger" and "How One Man Turned Hate into Heroism" dominated social media feeds. Journalists clamored for interviews, eager to speak with the man who had become an overnight symbol of calmness and courage. But James remained steadfast in his decision to stay out of the spotlight. "I'm not here for recognition," he told his commanding officer when asked about the growing public interest. "I was doing my duty, nothing more." His humility only added to the admiration people felt for him. Even within the regiment, whispers of pride circulated among his fellow guards. They knew how challenging it could be to maintain composure under such intense scrutiny, let alone when faced with outright hostility. James's actions had set a standard, a reminder of what it truly meant to embody the values of the Queen's Guard. Meanwhile, Richard Grayson found himself at the center of a very different kind of storm. The court case against him moved swiftly, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of his reckless behavior. Witness testimonies, coupled with the damning videos recorded by bystanders, painted a clear picture. Richard had deliberately provoked the situation, unleashing his dog with malicious intent. Worse still, his racially charged remarks left little room for sympathy. During the trial, the judge emphasized the severity of his actions, stating that inciting violence in a public space and targeting someone based on their heritage was unacceptable in any society. In the end, Richard was found guilty on multiple charges, including public disturbance, endangerment, and racial harassment. He received a sentence of community service and mandatory counseling sessions aimed at addressing his anger issues and biases. While some argued that the punishment wasn't harsh enough given the circumstances, others believed it was a step toward rehabilitation. Regardless, the verdict sent a strong message. Hatred and aggression would not be tolerated. Back at Buckingham Palace, life began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an extraordinary event. Tourists continued to flock to see the changing of the guard, many hoping to catch a glimpse of James. Some even brought gifts, small tokens of appreciation like handwritten notes or drawings of him with the German Shepherd. Though protocol prevented James from accepting these items directly, he couldn't deny the warmth they brought to his heart. It was humbling to realize that something as simple as staying calm and composed could inspire so much goodwill. One afternoon, while off duty, James decided to visit a local cafe near the palace. As he sat quietly sipping tea, a young boy approached him hesitantly, clutching a sketchpad. "Excuse me, sir," the child said shyly, holding out a drawing. In it, James stood tall in his uniform, the German Shepherd sitting loyally beside him. The boy explained that he wanted to thank James for showing everyone what real bravery looked like. Moved by the gesture, James knelt down to the boy's level and thanked him sincerely. "You know," he said with a gentle smile, "bravery isn't just about big moments like this. It's also about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." The encounter stayed with James long after he returned home. It reminded him of why he had chosen this path, to make a difference, however small, in the lives of others. Reflecting on everything that had transpired, he realized that the incident had taught him something valuable too. Hatred might flare brightly in moments of anger, but compassion had the power to extinguish it. By refusing to engage in Richard's provocations, he hadn't just diffused a dangerous situation. He had shown that kindness could prevail over cruelty. As weeks turned into months, the story of James Harrington became more than just a tale of heroism. It became a lesson in humanity. Schools began discussing it in classrooms, using it as an example of how discipline and empathy could transform conflict into connection. Community leaders praised James for setting an example of leadership under pressure, encouraging others to follow suit. And though James never sought recognition, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the opportunity to inspire change, even if it was simply through the way he carried himself. For James, the experience reinforced his belief in the importance of service, not just to the crown, but to humanity itself. Every time he donned his uniform and took his place outside Buckingham Palace, he did so with renewed purpose. He knew that beyond the pomp and tradition, his role was to protect, to lead, and to remind people that true strength lies not in dominance, but in understanding. Weeks had passed since the incident, and while life in the bustling streets of London continued as usual, the ripple effects of that day lingered. For James Harrington, The experience became a quiet turning point, a moment that shaped not only how others saw him but also how he viewed his role in the world. The attention hadn't faded entirely. People still recognized him occasionally, whether it was tourists pointing him out during the changing of the guard or strangers approaching him to express their gratitude. Yet, James remained grounded, focusing on what truly mattered, serving with integrity. During one of his rare days off, James decided to visit a local community center where he volunteered as part of an outreach program aimed at fostering understanding among young people. The initiative brought together children from diverse backgrounds, encouraging them to learn about different cultures and perspectives. It was something James had been passionate about even before the incident, but now he felt an even deeper sense of responsibility to contribute. He knew firsthand how harmful prejudice could be, and he wanted to help create a future where such hatred might have less room to grow. That afternoon, the community center buzzed with energy. Children laughed and played, their voices filling the air as they worked on art projects and group activities. When James walked in, several kids ran up to greet him, excited to see the guard who tamed the dog. Their innocence and curiosity reminded him of the boy who had given him the drawing at the cafe. Smiling warmly, James knelt down to chat with them, answering their endless questions about his uniform, his training, and of course, the infamous German Shepherd. One of the organizers, a kind woman named Sarah, pulled James aside after the initial excitement died down. "You've become quite the role model around here," she said with a grin. "The kids can't stop talking about you. They're fascinated by your story and inspired by how you handled yourself." James chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm just glad they're interested," he replied modestly. "If I can show them that staying calm and treating others with respect makes a difference, then maybe we're moving in the right direction." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James found himself reflecting on the conversation. Volunteering had always been fulfilling for him, but now it carried added weight. He thought about Richard Grayson and the anger that had driven him to act so recklessly. What if someone had taken the time to teach Richard empathy when he was younger? Could things have turned out differently? These questions stayed with James, fueling his determination to make a positive impact, no matter how small. Back at the barracks, James spent quiet moments journaling about his experiences. Writing helped him process everything. The fear he'd felt when the dog lunged at him, the frustration of hearing Richard's hateful words, and the overwhelming support from strangers afterward. But most of all, it allowed him to focus on the lessons he learned. One entry stood out: "Hatred is loud, but compassion speaks louder. My job isn't just to guard a palace, it's to protect values worth preserving: dignity, respect, and unity." His commanding officer noticed the change in James too. During a routine debriefing, he remarked on how James seemed more introspective lately. "You've always been disciplined," the officer said, "but there's something else now. A sense of purpose that goes beyond duty." James nodded thoughtfully. "I think I've realized that being a guard means more than standing tall in uniform," he explained. "It's about showing people what it means to lead with courage, not just in big moments, but every single day." As weeks turned into months, James continued balancing his responsibilities at Buckingham Palace with his volunteer work. Each role complemented the other, reinforcing his belief in the importance of service. At the palace, he represented tradition and honor. At the community center, he embodied hope and progress. Together, these roles painted a fuller picture of who he was: a man committed to making the world a better place, one interaction at a time. Though James never sought fame or recognition, he couldn't deny the profound effect his actions had on those around him. Strangers wrote letters thanking him for inspiring them to confront their own biases. Teachers reached out to share stories of students discussing his composure in classrooms. Even fellow guards approached him, admitting they'd been moved by his example. Through it all, James remained humble, reminding everyone that heroism wasn't about grand gestures. It was about choosing kindness, even in the face of adversity. And so, as he stood once again outside Buckingham Palace, watching the sunrise paint. Months had passed since the incident, and life in London carried on as it always did. Busy streets, crowded markets, and the ever-present hum of activity. But for Corporal James Harrington, the memory of that day remained vivid, a quiet reminder of the impact one moment could have on countless lives. Though he continued his duties with the same dedication and discipline, he couldn't help but notice subtle changes, not just in how people interacted with him, but in how he saw the world around him. One crisp autumn afternoon, while taking a rare walk through Hyde Park during his off hours, James encountered an unexpected face: the German Shepherd. At first, he didn't recognize the dog. It was no longer the snarling, aggressive creature he'd faced outside Buckingham Palace. Instead, it trotted happily beside a young woman, its tail wagging enthusiastically as it sniffed at the fallen leaves scattered across the path. When the dog caught sight of James, it froze for a moment, its ears perking up before it broke into a joyful sprint toward him. The woman, startled by the dog's sudden burst of energy, called out apologetically, "I'm so sorry. He's usually very well behaved. I don't know what's gotten into him." She hurried after the dog, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But when she reached James, she stopped short, recognition dawning on her face. "Wait, are you?" she began, her voice trailing off as she studied his features. James nodded politely, offering a small smile. "Yes, I believe we've met before," he said, kneeling down to greet the dog, which was now nudging his hand affectionately. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the tension and hostility. In its place was a calm, loving animal that seemed to remember James as a friend. The woman introduced herself as Emily Carter, explaining that she had adopted the dog after Richard Grayson relinquished ownership following his court case. "We named him Max," she said, smiling fondly at the dog. "He's been such a wonderful addition to our family. We've worked hard to train him properly and give him the love he deserves." James listened intently, touched by her words. It was clear that Max had found a second chance, a home filled with care and patience, far removed from the anger and neglect he'd endured under Richard's ownership. As they talked, Emily shared how deeply moved she had been by James's actions that day. "What you did, it meant so much to me," she admitted. "Not just because you protected yourself and others, but because you showed compassion, even when it would have been easier not to." Her sincerity struck a chord within James. He realized that his decision to handle the situation with calmness and empathy hadn't just affected him or the crowd that witnessed it. It had also paved the way for Max's redemption. Had James reacted differently, the dog might have been labeled dangerous and faced a grim fate. Instead, he had given Max, and indirectly, Emily, a fresh start. As they walked together along the park's winding paths, James and Emily exchanged stories about their lives. Emily spoke passionately about her work as a veterinary assistant and her love for rescuing animals in need. James, in turn, shared his experiences volunteering at the community center and his hopes for fostering greater understanding among younger generations. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, bridging two seemingly different worlds through shared values of kindness and service. Eventually, they paused near a pond where ducks glided lazily across the water. Max splashed happily at the edge, chasing after sticks Emily threw for him. Watching the scene unfold, James felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the opportunity to meet Max again, but for the reminder that even in moments of conflict, there is always room for healing and connection. Before parting ways, Emily thanked James once more, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You've inspired me to keep doing what I can to make a difference," she said. "And I hope you know, you're making a bigger impact than you realize." James shook his head modestly, though her words stayed with him long after their paths diverged. As he made his way back to the barracks, he reflected on the interconnectedness of it all. How one act of compassion could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he might never fully understand. That evening, as he stood guard outside Buckingham Palace, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every step he took, every choice he made, mattered, not just for himself, but for the countless individuals whose paths crossed his, however briefly. And so, James continued forward, carrying with him the lessons of that unforgettable day. Through every challenge and triumph, he held on to the belief that even in the face of hatred, compassion could light the way. And sometimes, the smallest gestures could leave the most lasting legacies. As the months turned into years, James Harrington's story became more than just a memory. It became a legacy. The incident outside Buckingham Palace had sparked something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just about the day a royal guard calmed an aggressive dog or stood firm against hatred. It was about the enduring power of compassion and dignity in the face of adversity. People didn't forget what they had witnessed, and neither did James. Every time he donned his red tunic and bearskin hat, stepping into position outside the palace gates, James carried with him the knowledge that his actions mattered, not just to those who watched him, but to future generations who might hear his story. Tourists still approached him occasionally, asking if he was the guard from the video. Some brought gifts, handwritten letters, small tokens of appreciation, or even drawings of him with Max, the German shepherd. Though protocol prevented him from accepting these items directly, their messages stayed with him, reminders of the impact kindness could have on strangers. Max himself became a symbol of redemption. Under Emily Carter's care, the once aggressive dog transformed into a gentle companion, beloved by everyone he met. Emily often took him to local schools and community events, using his story to teach children about second chances and the importance of treating animals and people with love and respect. She would tell them how one man's calmness and empathy had changed Max's life forever, inspiring many young listeners to think differently about conflict and forgiveness. James continued volunteering at the community center, where his presence inspired countless children. They looked up to him not because of his uniform, but because of the values he represented: patience, courage, and unwavering integrity. During one session, a shy boy named Liam asked James how he managed to stay so calm when faced with danger. James knelt down to meet the boy's gaze and said simply, "It's not about being fearless. It's about choosing to do the right thing, even when you're scared." That answer resonated deeply with Liam and the other kids. For weeks afterward, they talked about it during group activities, imagining themselves in situations where they too could choose kindness over anger. Teachers noticed a shift in the classroom dynamics as students began resolving conflicts peacefully and supporting one another more openly. It was a ripple effect, one that started with James and spread outward, touching lives in ways he might never fully see. Back at Buckingham Palace, James's commanding officer often praised him for setting an example of leadership under pressure. "You've reminded us all why we wear this uniform," the officer said during a private moment. "It's not just about tradition. It's about representing something bigger than ourselves." James nodded humbly, knowing that his role extended beyond guarding the palace. He was a guardian of values, a protector of principles that transcended time and place. Years later, when James finally retired from service, he didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, he dedicated himself fully to mentoring young people, sharing his experiences, and encouraging them to lead with compassion. His story was featured in documentaries, books, and school curriculums, serving as a testament to the power of grace under fire. Even Max played a part, accompanying Emily to events where she spoke about animal rescue and rehabilitation, always drawing attention back to the man who had shown the world what true strength looked like. On a sunny spring morning, long after his days as a royal guard were behind him, James returned to Hyde Park. Now older, with graying hair and a slower gait, he walked along the familiar paths, breathing in the fresh air and listening to the laughter of children playing nearby. As he reached the pond where he'd reconnected with Max years earlier, he spotted a familiar figure waiting for him: Emily, now joined by her teenage daughter, and of course, Max, whose muzzle had turned gray with age. "Look who's here to see you," Emily said with a warm smile, gesturing to Max, who wagged his tail feebly but happily. James knelt down, scratching behind the dog's ears one last time. "You've lived a good life, haven't you, boy?" he murmured softly. Max let out a contented sigh, resting his head on James's knee. Standing up, James turned to Emily and her daughter, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey, from the son of an immigrant to a symbol of resilience and hope, had come full circle. He knew that his story, like Max's, was proof that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always room for light. And sometimes, all it took was one act of courage to remind the world of what truly mattered. As he left the park that day, James glanced back at the trio, smiling to himself. His legacy wasn't written in stone or etched in metals. It was alive, carried forward by